be here is Aaron Chadbourne. Chadbourne? And he is here with his attorney, Cliff Ruprecht. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Raise your right hand. Do you promise the testimony, affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I absolutely do.
Thank you. I'm going to start with some questions from Mr. Chadbourne, and other committee members may have some as well. So thank you for being here this morning. The first question I have is, there was a June 5th meeting.
I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chadbourne had an opening statement.
Well, I apologize. We did say we would not afford you that opportunity, and please go ahead, sir.
You did, and I thank you for that, Senator. Senator Cates, Representative Kruger, and members of the Government Oversight Committee. I did want to take an opportunity briefly to introduce myself. I know that I've obviously appeared before several of you in your other committees, but there are a number of you that I've not yet met. My name is Aaron Chadbourne, and I serve as Senior Policy Advisor to the Governor, a position that I've only held for about 9 months. And it's a position that I consider a great honor. I grew up in Gorham, Maine, graduated from Gorham High School. I left Maine to attend Harvard for college. I know Senator Cates' alma mater. Also went to law school and business school, and then moved away to pursue a career helping companies and organizations grow and succeed. Around the time the governor was reelected, I was contemplating leaving the global strategy firm where I worked, and I looked into whether there were any interesting opportunities that would enable me to move back to Maine to be close to my family. By complete happenstance, I had coffee with a former member of Governor Baldacci's office, and he suggested that I reach out to this governor and let him know if I'd be willing to work to help get things done in Maine, because we have a lot of work to do to improve our state's economy, education system, and competitiveness to ensure Maine is on a path to prosperity. And that's how I came to sit before you today. Now, despite what we hear in the BDN, the initiative that I've been most publicly associated with to date was presenting the governor's proposed constitutional amendment to eliminate the state income tax, which in any other year might have been enough to catch the newspaper's attention, but I've gathered that this year is an exception. In addition to working on tax policy, my portfolio of responsibility is diverse, including education policy. And it's my involvement with education policy on behalf of the governor that caused me to be witness to some of the events described in the OPEGA report, which I'd like to comment on briefly. First, it's my opinion that the OPEGA report is thorough, and I believe that it documents well the series of events that took place concerning your subject of interest. Now, there are a few places where I disagree with the characterization that the authors of the report used, but overall, I think the underlying timeline and series of events is relatively accurate, and it satisfies OPEGA's fact-finding charge, which is why I have not found a need to comment on it before today. Second, I'm here today voluntarily. I've heard many people speculate that the governor's office might challenge your subpoena in court. However, I believe that doing so would only prolong the media's interest in this matter and the distraction it creates for the public and the hardworking men and women in the state of Maine government. We have other important things to focus on. So I'm happy to help satisfy the committee's inquiry and truthfully answer your questions where I have direct knowledge of the facts you are interested in finding. At your last meeting, Director Ashcroft made the suggestion that some witnesses might want to be subpoenaed in order to be protected from retribution. I want to assure you that is not the case for me. I have not discussed the content of my testimony with the governor, and the only thing he's ever said to me about being in front of you is that I should tell the truth. And that's what I'm here to do today. And in doing so, I hope to put an end to much of the unwarranted speculation that has surrounded my role in these events, or my willingness to cooperate with your fact-finding. In actuality, I'm eager for your fact-finding to conclude, and I welcome the committee's questions about any facts that I might have witnessed so that I can provide the clarification that you need to complete this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Chadbourne, there was a June 5th meeting that Commissioner Desjardins had with the governor regarding the logger training initiative. Were you at that meeting?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. And were you privy to a briefing memo that was done prior to that meeting that I guess the acting commissioner prepared?
Yes.
And in that briefing memo, the acting commissioner indicated that Speaker Reeves had actually been hired and was about to begin on July 1. Is that true?
I believe in the memo, the acting commissioner at the time indicated that they had made a selection. I don't believe he mentioned Speaker Hayes at all, and the first time I heard of it was during the meeting.
Okay. But a selection had been made, is that right?
You have the letter before you, Senator. I have it in front of me.
What did the commissioner tell you and the governor about that at that meeting about the speaker being hired?
Well, the commissioner indicated that, as in his memo, that a president had been hired, and the governor said, you didn't say who it is in your memo, and asked who it was. He said, it's the Speaker of the House, Mark Hughes.
And what was the governor's reaction?
I think his jaw dropped. He was very surprised. He was very surprised by that statement. And I think his instant reaction was something to the effect of, what does Mark Eves know about running a school for at-risk kids? The governor talked a lot about at-risk kids in that moment. He talked about his brothers, and he tried to picture what his brothers would do in that school and whether that was the appropriate leadership that they would need, and he voiced his concern that it wasn't. He asked a little bit about what qualifications Mark Eves might have had that would lead to such a selection, and he was just overwhelmingly puzzled. He also asked me a question, which I went and researched afterwards, about whether or not it was permissible under law, which it's not my role to provide legal guidance to the governor, so I took that question to Sarah Forrester, but whether it's permissible under law for a member of the legislature to be employed by a charter school that receives its funding directly from the state.
And this was also at that first meeting?
Correct.
As far as you know, sir, was that the first time the governor had learned about the speaker's hiring?
Yes, and by the surprised look on his face and his reaction, I take it to be the first time.
Was there any discussion at that first meeting about will-hinckley's funding?
No.
And what, if anything, did the governor ask you or the commissioner to do at that meeting?
Other than that one inquiry to find out whether or not it was permitted under law for a sitting member of the legislature to be employed by an organization that receives funding from the state, nothing.
Was there anyone else at that meeting, as you recall?
No.
By the way, for your benefit and for the benefit of everybody else, the reason there are going to be so many questions directed to you and Ms. Montgomery in particular is because you were not interviewed before by the LePage staff.
Correct.
So a lot of the background you might already have, you don't have, so that's why it's going to take a little while. What is your understanding of what the governor did next with respect to this issue after that meeting, sir?
I don't know that I have any other information than what's provided in the OPEGA report. There's nothing that I would characterize as that.
Apparently, the governor called the acting president of will-hinckley, Rich Abramson, on June 5th. Were you were aware of that call?
Only from reading it in your report and the characterization publicly.
Did the governor ever discuss that call with you at any time before or after?
No.
Were you aware of the governor's call to Greg Powell at the Harold Alphon Foundation also on June 5th?
Again, not at the time, no.
And did the governor ever discuss that call with you at some later time?
I've only heard the governor characterize it in his public comments. It might come as a surprise to members of this committee, but the governor has said much more about this matter publicly than he has privately.
Okay. So what did you hear him say in any form?
About
the call from Mr. Powell?
Again, I've just heard him publicly acknowledge that he did call him.
Did you have any other meetings, Mr. Chadbourne, with the governor on the subject of the speaker's hiring in the period between June 5th and June 8th? Do you recall? That's been, the June 8th cabinet meeting is June 9th. So any discussions with the governor before the cabinet meeting that you've not already?
Before the cabinet meeting, the only interaction I had with the governor on the matter pertained to the formal letter that we were preparing to send to Jack Moore that we submitted to him on June 8th.
Okay, and tell us about those discussions if you can.
The only discussions that we had is that it was his desire to send a letter to Chairman Jack Moore. I believe in my conversation with Sarah Vanderwood, she had asked whether the governor might want to speak to Mr. Moore. I asked the governor whether he would be interested in speaking to Mr. Moore, and he said no. I decided we'll send him a letter so that he knows that I have concerns with the selection that they've made, and I don't find Mark Hughes qualified. I suggested some of what we might put in that letter, and that's what we worked on.
Okay, Sarah Vanderwood was a person who was employed as a lobbyist by will-hinckley around this time period, is that right?
Correct, and for a while before that, I think.
And you had at least one meeting with her, perhaps more. I'd like you to walk us through those if you could.
Sure. After my meeting with the governor, I think the first thing I did was actually come to the Attorney General's office to speak with Sarah Forrester to research the question of law. But upon returning to my office, I called Sarah Vanderwood and I asked her to stop by my office. My intention in that conversation was to ask her whether she had any information about whether someone had been indeed selected as president of Goodwill Hinckley. I hadn't heard about it previously, and it's been my experience that a number of the schools, university, the community college system, they tend to reach out to me to make sure the governor's aware when they made a selection. It's common practice and I think a courtesy, and quite often they're looking to make sure that he has confidence in who they've selected. That had not occurred at this time, so I called Sarah Vanderwood in an attempt to confirm what Acting Commissioner Chadbourne had told the governor, and she said she had no knowledge of that and she'd get back to me.
Is that at anybody's directive that you reached out to her?
No, it was at my own attempt to verify the information I heard that morning.
Did Ms. Vanderwood, if you know, go ahead and contact the school and get back to you with respect to
I think she
hiring?
came back to see me again later that afternoon with information.
Tell us about that meeting.
Sarah Vanderwood came and said that she had looked into it. It's not something she had heard about. I think she was surprised to learn of it. And I think at the time I said, okay. I let her know that the governor had expressed concerns about Speaker Eve's qualifications, didn't think that he was qualified, and was particularly concerned about whether this decision had been made in the best interest of the students at Goodwill Hinckley.
From the report, we've learned that her impression from meeting with you was that the funding for Goodwill Hinckley School would now be in jeopardy if the speaker were hired. I'm sure you read that in the report.
I did, sir.
Okay, and what was there in your discussion with her that would have led her to that conclusion?
I think the question that she asked me most directly was whether I thought the governor would still be willing to speak at their commencement, and I said I couldn't confirm that at that time. I thought he might not want to. She said that she knew that Glenn Cummings would be speaking at the commencement as well, and wondered if that was his concern. I let her know that no, the governor had a lot of confidence in Glenn Cummings and in his leadership of the school, and I did not see that as a concern. However, I did think the governor had now concerns about the management of the school, and he might not wish to attend their commencement.
Well, she left the meeting with the impression that the funding for the school was in jeopardy. What did you say that led her to that conclusion?
You'd have to ask her that question, sir. I don't know what created an impression for Sarah Vanderwood. I was relatively new to the governor's office at the time. I was not familiar with the details of the funding for Goodwill Hinckley, and so anything that she may have inferred from my comments was not a direct result of things that I said. The funding at no time came up, and so you'd have to ask Sarah Vanderwood about that.
Did anybody suggest to you that you convey the message to her that in any way the funding for Goodwill Hinckley would now be in jeopardy?
Never. Nor to anyone else. I've never been asked to convey a message to anyone, whether at Goodwill Hinckley or elsewhere, about the funding and being in jeopardy. It's never been suggested, Senator.
That's never been suggested that you do that?
No one's ever directed me to or asked me to.
Have you done that?
No.
Did you have any other communications or meetings with her in the period before the cabinet meeting that we've not already talked about?
Not that I recall. There may have been incidental communication. I had asked her at one point for contact information from Mr. Moore in anticipation of sending the letter, and I think she and I communicated about whether, I think over the phone, about whether or not the governor might be willing to meet with them.
The report also indicates that on the morning of June 5th that the acting commissioner was called back to the governor's office, and that he then called Mr. Moore, the Goodwill Hinckley board chair. Were you aware of that phone call?
I was not aware of the phone call. A number of things were happening that morning, Senator, and I wasn't in the governor's office for all of them. I do remember being out of the office, being back in the office, and the acting commissioner being generally around. I don't believe that he met with the governor, as I'm generally present when he's met with the governor.
Did the commissioner ever, I'm going to call him the commissioner ever discuss that phone call with you?
He may have, but not in a significant way that I recall.
You don't recall anything he might have told you about that call?
Not particularly. There were a lot of conversations taking place at that point, and that doesn't stand out to me.
Okay. When did you become aware that the governor had written a handwritten note to Mr. Moore, the chair of the board of Goodwill Hinckley?
I suspect it was when you became aware of it, when it was first reported in the press.
Okay. You don't recall any knowledge of it before that?
I recall that I had no knowledge of it before that.
Okay. Any other meetings that you had with Commissioner Chadbourne on June 5th or at any time before that tonight's cabinet meeting that we haven't talked about?
The acting commissioner and I were in constant communication. This is one of very many issues that were before the governor's office at the time. As you all recall, it was the end of session. The budget had not closed yet. The committee that you sit on, Senator Cates, had not yet issued its majority and minority reports. So there were many issues that I was in contact with Commissioner Chadbourne. So I couldn't recall for you every one of them.
The commissioner, Desjardins, has told us, the staff, that he believed you were present during a conversation that he had with the governor, when the governor told him that he didn't want to send Goodwill-Hinckley any funding that was not required by law. Do you recall being present at that meeting?
I do.
Okay, and do you recall when that was?
I don't recall specifically, but I've looked at my calendar in anticipation you asked me that question. The best guess that I have for you of when that conversation may have taken place would have been following the cabinet meeting. The governor had previously scheduled a meeting with Commissioner Desjardins to discuss a teacher certification issue related to a specific school because a constituent had reached out to him, and that was on the calendar immediately following the cabinet meeting. And I believe it was at that meeting where the conversation took place.
Okay, could you tell us, as you recall, who was there and what was said?
It was within the governor's office, myself, the acting commissioner, and the governor. And it was not at all a focal point of the conversation. I think it was an incidental comment made as the commissioner and I were leaving the room. I think the acting commissioner made a comment about the governor's past advocacy for more funding for Goodwill-Hinckley, and I can't recall the exact substance of that. And that was at the point that the governor very clearly said, well, after the budget is passed, I want you to read it carefully, and we'll give them exactly what we're required by law, and nothing more.
Thank you. In the last paragraph on page 14 of the report, there was reference to at least two conversations you've had with Mr. Moore. Again, Mr. Moore is the chair of the Goodwill-Hinckley board. I'd like to walk through those with you if I could. I think you reached out to Mr. Moore, is that true?
Yes.
And what was your purpose in doing so?
On June 8th, which is the first date, so let me give you both dates first. The first date of our conversation was June 8th.
You need to stop just for a second. At anybody's directive you were calling Mr. Moore, or was that
No,
your decision?
it was my decision.
Go ahead. Thank you.
And my decision on June 8th, and the second conversation, I actually don't have a specific date for you. I think it was immediately before the 4th of July, because he had mentioned he was going fly fishing for the weekend. But that was just to let him know that I was providing his contact information to Cindy Montgomery, and she might be contacting him, given that there was pending litigation and brief conversation sometime in July. On June 8th, my purpose for calling him Senator was to let him know that I had spoken with Sarah Vanderwood prior to the weekend. She had indicated he might like to meet with the governor, and I had given her the indication he might be willing to meet. I wanted to let him know that the governor had decided that he'd instead send him a letter outlining his concerns with their selection of the speaker, and that the governor had hoped that they would continue the selection process. Now, at that point in time, we had just been through a selection process at the University of Maine at Orono, which did not result in a final candidate. They extended the search process for a year. I think a similar decision was made at the Maine Community College. So it was a process that I was familiar with, people extending the presidential search process until they found someone. It was at that time that Mr. Moore indicated that, I think in this conversation, Mr. Moore, because I didn't speak to him after that, indicated to me that I think the speaker had signed the contract over the weekend. And I said, well, it sounds like the board has made its decision, and there's nothing really more to speak about.
Okay. Have you told us everything you told Mr. Moore about the governor's reaction to the news of the speaker being hired?
The conversation was longer than that, and I think the basis of our conversation, I think I laid out the objections in the governor's letter. I spent a lot of time discussing with him Speaker Eves' perceived lack of qualification by the governor to serve as the president of Goodwill-Hinckley. He asked whether or not, and I think this is what he says in the report, he asked whether or not he's objecting because he was a Democrat. I let him know that Glenn Cummings, he thought was very qualified, had a great background prior to being selected to lead that school. He was not objecting because it's a Democrat. I think there were many other people the governor could suggest, and it wasn't on the basis of political party or politics. It was because the governor was most concerned about finding the right leader for that school. The school is relatively new and being established as a charter school, and their funding situation has not been self-sustaining to date, and he wanted to make sure that the leader there had strong management experience and a strong educational background that would best serve those kids.
That's what you told Mr. Moore?
Absolutely, yes.
Mr. Moore left that conversation, sir, with the impression that the funding for Goodwill-Hinckley is now in jeopardy. Did you tell him that?
I did not.
This is now the second person who leaves a conversation with you believing that the funding for Goodwill-Hinckley is now in jeopardy because of a hiring decision. what did you say to him that led him to that conclusion?
If I read your report correctly, Senator, I take a couple of things. First, both of those witnesses told you that I never brought up the funding situation. I'm telling you now, I didn't even know about the extra $530,000 that was in the budget because it's not a part of the budget that I worked on before it had been submitted. It's not a part of the budget that I reviewed or worked on when it was before the legislature. It's not something I was aware of. Now, what is clear from your report is it's something that was very front of mind for those individuals. So if Sarah Vanderwood, a lobbyist who's hired to look for any indication that that funding might be in jeopardy, thought that the governor not speaking at their commencement was such an indication, I can't speak to anything other than that.
So we have now two folks who came away from conversations with you thinking the funding was in jeopardy, and you can think of nothing you said that lead either.
I told them the governor disapproved of their
Let me finish
selection.
my question. You can't think of anything that you said which led either of those people to conclude that the funding was now in jeopardy, sir?
I think I've been completely forthcoming with you, Senator Cates, in the fact that I told them the governor disapproved of the management's selection they had made for their school. What conclusions they drew from that is a question you have to ask them. But I did not at any time reference the funding, nor was I aware of the extraordinary funding that the only school that receives this type of funding outside of the charter school formula.
Now, on June 5th, when there was some talk, by someone at least, about withholding Goodwill-Hinckley's funding, did you know that Goodwill-Hinckley had an active grant agreement with the Alphon Foundation?
I did not.
When did you first learn of that, if you recall?
I believe as it was reported in the press I think it was just before the speaker terminated his contract, it was reported in the press.
Do you know when and how the governor first learned that the Harold Alphon Foundation continued funding in future years might be in jeopardy?
I do not know that, sir.
Were you present, Mr. Chadbourne, at the cabinet meeting on June 9th?
Yes.
Can you tell us what was... Sorry. $10, Mr. Merrill?
Sorry.
I think he's getting you back for not giving him credit for getting the exclusive on the speaker's hiring.
I'm going to ask him about that while I think I want to ask you about that meeting, and can you tell us, in addition to the cabinet members, generally who was there?
I don't think the audience differed from a typical cabinet meeting.
Paul, about what was discussed at that meeting about the Goodwill-Hinckley matter?
To be perfectly honest with you, until I read it in the report, it was not something that I distinctly remembered. I vaguely remember the governor making a side throwaway comment about the fact that Speaker Eves now wanted to run a charter school. And I do recall acting commissioner at the time, Thomas Jardine, saying, "Oh, we'll see how that goes by the end of the day." I think that was the extent of the conversation as it pertained to that matter.
Sorry, what was that last part about? the end of the
As
day?
reported in the OPEGA report, Commissioner Jardine did make a comment saying, "We'll see if that's still the case by the end of the day," because as your report indicates, I think he believed that the decision.
The decision.
Again, it's in your report. I don't know.
Sorry, I just couldn't hear what you said. The decision had been made.
Might change.
I see.
I think he was saying, again, I'll refer you to your report for what he said. I don't know if you can ask him.
Do you recall the governor giving anyone any instructions or directives about doing anything at that cabinet meeting?
No.
Were you involved in any way, sir, in the decision to withhold the first quarter payment to Goodwill-Hinckley that happened on June 9th?
No, and I was not aware that it happened until I was contacted by the media or our press office was.
Have you now learned whether the governor or whether anyone else in his office was involved in making that decision?
I am confident that no one other than the commissioner was involved in making that decision.
When did you first learn about the commissioner's decision to withhold the payment?
It was, I'd have to check my documents for the date at which we received the inquiry in like June from a reporter about it. That was the first I heard.
Do you know how the governor learned that the payment had been withheld?
I do not, and I do not recall discussing it with him.
Mr. Chadbourne, other than the interactions and communications we've already discussed here this morning, were there any additional interactions and communications that you sir, had with anybody at Goodwill-Hinckley, at the school at Goodwill-Hinckley, or with your attorneys at any time regarding the matter of the speaker being hired and the issue of the funding?
The only two interactions or conversations I had that I did not see reflected in the report were Monday, June 8th. I attended an event at the University of Maine at Augusta, and was approached by former President of will-hinckley, at the time interim President of the University of Augusta, and now the President of the University of Southern Maine, Glenn Cummings, who were there to sign an agreement between the University of Maine system and the Maine Community College system on credit transfer. Mr. Cummings mentioned to me that he heard that the governor didn't approve of their selection of Mark Eves to run the school. I said, right, he doesn't believe that he's qualified. And Glenn Cummings said, well, you know, there are other folks at the school that the governor can have confidence in. And that was the extent of that conversation.
Thank you. Do you recall any other interactions or communications with the governor or others in the governor's office on this subject of will-hinckley?
No, but to answer your first question, I said there were two instances. The first was Glenn Cummings, and the second was Speaker Eves. Speaker Eves stopped me in the parking lot. He pulled up his car beside me and said, oh, I've heard that you've been in touch with Jack Moore and the governor has some concerns. And I said, yes, that's true. He said, well, hopefully we can get by those.
Any other discussions with Commissioner Chadbourne or the staff at the Department of Education on the subject matter we've talked about today that we have not discussed this morning?
The only other one, and to your, again, just prior question, you said the governor and the governor's office, the only other conversation that I had with the governor on this topic was on the 10th, after it had been announced by the school that Mark Eves would be selected as president. The governor was traveling out of state and called me because he had heard something on the radio about education funding more broadly. When I called him back to give him the question, the answer to the question, so that he could understand what they were talking about on the radio, he mentioned that he wanted me to start working on charter school laws. He said, I want to make sure now that Speaker Eves is president of will-hinckley that we have the toughest charter school laws, the best charter school laws in the country. It was a comment I relayed to Acting Commissioner Chadbourne. The Acting Commissioner got back to me and said because ours are so new, they are some of the best. And when I relayed that back to the governor, his reaction was no, Arizona's ranked #1, Maine's only ranked #3, and there's more that we can do, particularly if the speaker is now interested in charter schools. And that was my last interaction about Speaker of the House and leading will-hinckley.
Thank you. Any other interactions with Greg Powell or anybody else from the Harold Alphon Foundation that you had that we have not talked about this morning?
Not in that time frame and not about this matter. I've interacted with the Alphon Foundation on other matters.
Not on this one. You aware of any other interactions or communications between the governor or other members of the governor's staff and Harold Alphon Foundation that we have not discussed this morning?
I have no knowledge of anything else personally.
You just told us about a casual conversation you had with the speaker in the parking lot. Any other communications you had with the speaker or any of his attorney regarding this matter?
I don't believe I've ever had any communication with his attorney, and that's the only time the Speaker of the House stopped me to speak to me about it.
Okay. I apologize, I may have asked you this before, but when did you first become aware of Harold Alphon Foundation's concern about what was happening in terms of the potential losses?
At the same time,
Someday this may be a transcript, I hope not, but so let me finish my question.
I think under law it's required to be. So.
Actually not. It just has to be not a recording. We'll talk about that later. But in any event, how did you aware of, excuse me, let me rephrase that. When did you become aware that the Harold Alphon Foundation was expressing concern about the impact of potential state funding?
At the same time that the public did when it was reported in the Bangor Daily News.
At any time since the OPEGA began its review of this, which was, I believe, on July 1st, have you been involved in coordinating or discussing with the Commissioner or others at the Department of Education what documents would be provided to OPEGA?
The direction that I provided to the Commissioner as well as to the members of the Department of Education were that they should cooperate fully with OPEGA and that they should be truthful and provide exactly what they're asked for.
Okay, did you discuss with them any details about what information would be shared or not shared?
I think several times the Commissioner did reach out to let us know what he was sharing. I have at no time given any direction about what he should do. I've said that it's his decision to make.
Other than that, are you aware of any other coordination or discussions occurring that did not involve you about what was going to be produced?
Again, I only think the coordination that we provided was to make sure that we understood which documents had already been provided and which ones he was providing and other ones. Okay. I think there may have been questions about whether there were any he considered to be privileged, and I don't have any awareness of that conversation. So.
Thank you very much for your answers. I'm sure others will have questions. Chairman Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for coming today, Mr. Chadbourne. Appreciate it. One point that I just wanted to make sure you were aware of is that will-hinckley, the organization has been around for 126 years. It's not a new entity. And the charter school is just one part of the organization which Mr. Eves was hired to lead, just to clarify.
Thank you, and I do understand that.
Okay.
The new part I was referring to was the charter school. As we know, we haven't had charter schools that long in Maine, and
Right.
the governor is quite invested in ensuring that they're successful.
Okay, my first question is, in your experience, is it common for the governor to insert himself into the internal affairs of an independent institution?
You've asked me that question before, Representative Kruger, when I saw you in Rockland, and I don't know that I would comment on what's common or what's not. I think there are a lot of institutions you could say are an external institution to the Maine State government. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, the governor and I had lunch at the Blaine House with several recently returned veterans who wanted to express their concerns about the VA hospital in Tokens. It's not an institution that we control, or that we have any direct funding of, or that we really have any say about. But they were asking the governor to advocate on their behalf and to make inquiries about the director and the PR spokesperson for Tokens. And it's very common for him to respond when there are concerns that he does believe affect Maine people. And I think that, the governor is interested in the management and oversight and operations of the school and making sure the school is successful. As I indicated, other schools, the university system, Chancellor Page is in regular touch when he's wanting to let the governor know about decisions he's made and presidents that have been selected to lead their schools. We regularly receive those comments, and not only that, I went back after our conversation in Rockland and looked to see whether there's precedent for this at all. And the precedent I did find was the episode I was previously unaware of in 2013 when Speaker of the House, Mark Eves, and then Senate President Justin Alfon were asking, I think this committee, I think they directed their letter to the Education Committee, but they were asking this committee to look into the management and the decisions being made for the leadership at the Baxter Academy when it became a charter school. I know some of you will remember that at the time, Mayor Brennan of Portland had instructed the superintendent of schools in Portland to withhold hundreds of thousands of dollars of mandatory taxpayer dollars that were intended to go to that school. And rather than ask questions about Mayor Brennan's decision at the time, the Speaker of the House and the Senate President asked questions about the management of the school, and they asked questions about the Charter Commission. So I certainly don't think that this is the first time that the governor had a concern about an organization that doesn't work as part of the executive branch of the state of Maine government, nor do I think it's the first time that, even as I've shown, presiding officers of the legislature looked into the management decisions being made at the charter school.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions, Mr. Chadbourne? Representative Stracchio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for coming today, Mr. Chadbourne.
My pleasure.
I'm just trying to get back to the question of the fact that people remember things happening that you don't remember, and I'm referencing the report like you have, and it just said, right, I'm reading this, the will-hinckley board chair at the time, that was Mr. Moore, also recalled having 2 conversations with the governor's senior policy advisor, that is you.
Correct.
But did not provide any specific dates. He recounted that one of these times the senior policy advisor contacted him specifically to say that, and this is in quotes from him, "We would have trouble supporting Goodwill Hinckley if you hire the speaker." Are you saying that that's true or not true?
First of all, I'm saying that it is true that I had those 2 conversations. I am characterizing the comments that I made, which was very, very clear and unequivocal that the governor did not believe the Speaker of the House was qualified. I didn't record the conversation. I don't have an exact transcript. I don't believe Mr. Moore was intending to provide you with a direct transcript of the conversation. However, I was very clear that the governor did not support the decision they had made, and that it was the board's decision, and that they had a difference of opinion when it came to his qualifications to lead the school.
So you're saying that you didn't say that you would have trouble supporting Goodwill Hinckley, or are you saying that you did say that?
I'm saying I don't know which words I used, Representative, and I'm trying to be as honest and transparent as I can. I don't know which words that I used.
Well,
I'm not saying that I didn't say it. I'm saying that the message I was intending to send, which I believe was heard very loudly by Chairman Moore, was that the governor disagreed with their selection, and he did not have confidence that the board was making the decisions in the best interest of the school.
So, once again, I'm just going to ask you again because I really don't understand. I'm kind of a simple person. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a citizen legislator. To me, if somebody said that to me, I would think, well, what does that really mean? And Mr. Moore, who we had here in front of us, clearly took it to mean that financial support was what you were talking about.
I cannot speak to what Mr. Moore thought.
Well, I guess I'm asking you, what did you intend? What did you intend to let him know? I mean, what was your point then? How is it your business?
Let me direct you to the
How-
governor's letter
why
on
should
June
we
8th.
care?
What my
Like, what-
business was to communicate
Can
with
I
the
just say one
governor.
other thing? How can we know? I mean, what are you there for? I mean, what did you have to say about it? Is it any of your business at all who Goodwill Hinckley hires unless you have something that you can hold over their head? What's your hammer? Your hammer is, oh, the governor's unhappy? That doesn't seem, in my world, that isn't, and I go, well, gee, my kids used to be unhappy when I would tell them they couldn't have something or do something. I go, well, gee, that's too bad. You know, really, what can you do about it? But so what was your hammer? What was the point of what you were doing other than to say, oh, he's unhappy, unless you thought it was going to go somewhere else? So that's what I'm asking, and I'm not, this isn't lawyer speak, I'm looking at it pretty simply, and Mr. Moore was in front of us, and he seemed to clearly think that there was a domino, and that it started with a conversation that he was hearing, and it just built from one to the other, and that he isn't the only one that had that characterization. There were others that did too. So I'm using the report, and I think that it's easy to say, well, I didn't say it quite like that, but really, what did you mean otherwise, and why was it your business?
First of all, my job in the governor's office when I work on education policy is to work to advance the governor's agenda, ensure that every child in the state of Maine is receiving a quality education, one that prepares them for a successful future, for careers, and the governor lacked confidence in the selection process and the selection that the board made. That was my unequivocal message. Communicating to Mr. Moore that the governor lacked confidence in the decision their board has made, I'm not surprised that he took that as a lack of the governor's support, because he lacked confidence in their decision-making about the management of the school. And Representative, I don't know, I don't engage in the type of tactics that you suggest where I believe in hammers. So rhetorical devices aside, my clear intent was to let the board of the school know that the governor disagreed, and my real intent of the phone call was to let them know that the governor had decided to send them a letter that contained the same information I was conveying right then. And so that was what I intended. That is what I said. I cannot speak to the exact words. I'm not sure that Chairman Moore was trying to tell you the exact words, but if he took from me saying that the governor lacked confidence in the decision the board had made and how they were managing the school, that the governor no longer supported them, I can understand why he would draw the conclusion.
Yes, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what was your intent, though? I mean, so I say this to them, and then what did you expect them to do? You expected them to ignore you, I mean, what was the point then? If you didn't have anything that you could, or knew that was going to be held over them, what was the point of what you were, of the whole conversation?
Again, Representative, I don't engage in the type of thing where I hold something over a phone. If that's something that you do, that's a decision for you to make. Now, I don't engage in that, and that is not the intention. If you read the governor's letter on June 8th that I was calling to let Chairman Moore know about, the governor says, I encourage you to continue your search process. It was not known at that time whether the speaker had signed a contract or whether the decision had been voted on by the board. It was not something that I knew. It's not something I believe the governor knew. And so we were intending to say, if the board has not made a final decision here, we don't think that's a qualified candidate, and we encourage you to, the governor wanted to encourage the board to continue the selection process. That's the message that the governor intended to deliver in the letter, and I didn't mean to convey anything other than that during my communication to Jack Moore.
Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the selection process, and I did want to ask you about that, because you said a few moments ago that the governor had no confidence in two things. One was the selection process, and the second was the result of that selection process. We've talked a lot about the second, but we now know there was a selection process that involved advertising and applications and rounds of interviews and the rest. When did you first become aware, if you did, before the report came out, about what that selection process was?
I believe I knew that they were conducting a search for a president. I think it had been a topic of conversation that there was a search while Richard was
That's not my
back in
question.
April.
Obviously, there
You
was
asked
a
me to become
search.
aware. So I think the first time I heard anything of the search was in April when we met with the school. Second, I didn't learn anything else about that search until Commissioner Jardin met with the governor on, I think, Friday, June 5th.
I'm not talking about whether there was a search or not. I'm talking about the selection process, about how it was that they came to the conclusion about hiring someone. Applications, interviews, vetting, second rounds of interviews, campus visits, all the rest of it. When did you first learn, before the report came out, about what the actual selection process had been?
I think Chairman Moore may have mentioned a couple of the details about it, but not any great depth during our phone conversation, when he was trying to explain why the committee had a different perspective than the governor on the selection marking.
And what is your knowledge about, what if anything, the governor learned about the actual selection process that will-hinckley had engaged in?
I don't know what all the governor has heard outside of what's been in the report.
So when you say that there was a lack of confidence in the selection process as opposed to the result, what do you mean?
I think when the governor learned, number one, that when he went to write his letter to the chairman of the board and well as the chairman of the Means School, he discovered that the chairman of the Means School Board was a staffer in Speaker Eads' office. It didn't pass the straight face test for him.
What knowledge did the governor have about what involvement that person had or did not have in the selection process? Do you know?
Again, I believe it's what's contained in your report. I don't think he has any additional knowledge.
He learned it from the report.
I'm not sure where he's learned it, but I do know that he's aware.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Other questions? Representative Mastracchio, excuse me, Senator Johnson first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Going back to that same time frame, and the governor had already communicated in the letter during the search and selection process his feelings regarding Speaker Eads, I understand. What was he hoping to accomplish through now having heard that there was a selection leaning towards, didn't know what regarding the hiring yet, that was later in the day. It was Speaker Eads. What was your aim in having this additional conversation, this additional letter? Why would the governor feel that this decision that the will-hinckley board is authorized under statute and the charter and bylaws to make as a decision should be communicated about once again?
To my knowledge, Senator, this is the only letter that I was involved in, and it was what the governor asked. He wanted to make known to the board the disagree with the decision, and that's the letter that he sent on June 8th.
Thank you. Representative DeShane.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for testifying today.
Good to see you.
Precedents notwithstanding, Baxter, for instance, this is actually the first time funding was withheld for anything. We have a factual circumstance where funding was withheld. The governor has expressed that this was a bad decision, encouraged the search, but when that didn't happen, the funds were withheld. People in the Opega report felt that there was a threat conveyed by you or somebody. The threat actually was carried out. How do we reconcile these two?
In terms of the check that was not sent, I have to direct you to the acting commissioner. I had no involvement.
I thought that was probably what you would say, and I suspect you're right. Were you aware of the governor instructing anyone else to convey concerns about funding to will-hinckley?
I had no direct knowledge of that.
In the Channel 8 interview, the governor said about cutting off the funding, I did it, why wouldn't I? Now, you were not involved in that decision whatsoever.
Correct.
Right. And you weren't directed by anybody, or you didn't direct anybody to carry out the funding cutoff?
Correct.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Good to see you,
Thank
Senator.
you for being here. I need to take you to a different date. I just need to tie some ends up here.
Okay.
On May 15th, the Board of Directors at Hinckley voted unanimously to hire Speaker Eads. On May 22nd, Mr. Moore met with Mr. Desjardins, the acting commissioner, and discovered his discomfort. And according to the report, according to Mr. Desjardins' interpretation at least, offered the job to Mr. Desjardins after a week earlier having voted with the board unanimously to hire Mr. Eads. Were you aware of that, and do you know why? Was that something the governor had asked Mr. Moore to do, or had he had any conversation with you or anyone else that you know of that would suggest to Mr. Moore that he offer the job to Mr. Desjardins?
The first knowledge I had of any of this was on Friday, June 5th. Friday, June 5th, when the commissioner spoke to the governor.
Okay, so anything happened prior to that?
I had no knowledge.
You had no knowledge at all? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Mastracchio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to follow up on that conversation that where Mr. Moore really came out of that meeting with you thinking, you know, funding. Did he actually ask you, did Mr. Moore ask you if the funding for Goodwill Hinckley was in jeopardy?
No.
So he just kind of factored that out of thin air.
You have to ask him.
We did, and that he told us you told him.
I don't believe he's
I-
ever said that I made any comments about the funding for Goodwill Hinckley.
Your support, the funding was in jeopardy were the words that were used.
I don't believe he's ever said that I said that, and I certainly never said that verbatim.
So you're denying that he got that impression from?
I'm not denying anything about his impression. You'll have to ask him about his impression or what he thought based on what I said, but I am telling you that
I'm
I
just
never
telling you
discussed
that
the
we
funding.
asked him, and in his mind, Goodwill Hinckley funding was in jeopardy, and that was conveyed to him by you.
Again, I'm not going to dispute whatever conclusions he may have drawn from our conversation, but it is not something I ever spoke to him about or said in words.
Thank you. Any further questions, Mr. Chadbourne? Yeah. Thank you very much for being here. I forgot to ask you. Oh, I'm sorry. Pardon me, Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Did you, in that same meeting, discuss the budget and the work going on the budget?
In which meeting, Senator?
The meeting with Mr. Moore.
I only had a brief conversation with him by phone, and no, we never discussed the budget.
Anything further? Mr. Chadbourne, can you confirm that the records which we produced today are all the records you have?